Okay, so I'm going to speak about the process of building research infrastructures in Europe and beyond. And what I will say is very much lessons learnt from being the person who was responsible for the first stages of building the ELIXIR infrastructure in Europe. And to give you a little bit of a background about what ELIXIR is, it was really built to safeguard the results of life science research in Europe. It involves the data challenges, data production, which is obviously increasing across Europe. And you can see here an omics map of Europe with the many sites. And I think probably now there are many more that are generating omics data. So the growth in life science data has been enormous and is continuing to be enormous. And obviously part of this data is human data. And so we need to worry about getting secure access and governance of this human data. And lastly, many of the funders in Europe, the national funders and the European Commission, have set out mandates to ensure that the data that are generated through their funding schemes is made open. And so there needs to be an infrastructure in Europe which will take these data and make them open for everybody to use. And to enable that, we established the ELIXIR infrastructure, which is a distributed infrastructure across Europe, in which you will see from the slide, there is a hub, and there are also nodes in our member states. The current status of ELIXIR is that there are 21 countries, of which, and EMBL is also a member. We have one observer, Cyprus, and you can see from the map that fundamentally we cover most of Europe. So ELIXIR provides 5 key platforms: a data platform, an interoperability platform, a tools platform, a compute platform, and a training platform. And these technical platforms are complemented by specific use cases that change over time. And at the moment, we have a marine metagenomics, a rare diseases, human data, plant sciences, and most recently, the proteomics, metabolomics, and galaxy use cases. So this is the structure, if you like, of ELIXIR. And it now seems very logical and very sensible. But when we started, we weren't exactly sure what we wanted to deliver and how we could deliver it. And so these are the steps that we went through. And you can see in the arrow, the first step following the announcement that there would be a computational biology infrastructure was preparing for the preparatory phase. The next step was a preparatory phase, then an interim phase, and finally the implementation phase. So in the pre-preparatory phase, we had to write a grant to the European Commission to fund the preparatory phase. The preparatory phase is making the plan to construct the infrastructure, and the interim phase occurred because the preparatory phase ran out and we weren't quite ready to implement. And so we had to sign a memorandum of understanding that, and then the infrastructure could be implemented. So I'll go through these steps and explain what we did in each of these steps, where the challenges were, and ultimately how we got there in the end. So the pre-prep phase, in my looking back on this, it was essentially building a community of leaders in computational infrastructures across Europe. So, of course, deciding who was going to be a member, who would lead, who would do the work, which scientists are involved, what will the infrastructure deliver, what's the structure of the grant, and actually writing the grant is a non-trivial task. And I have to say that this was very much facilitated by previous EU grants and the scientists involved in those, in our case, Biosapiens and Embrace, because through those grants, we already had a community of people who knew each other and who essentially wanted to work together to create this infrastructure. Once we'd written the grant and were successful, we then got some funds towards effectively writing a business case for the infrastructure. And I've highlighted here 5 main tasks. The first one was to engage the stakeholders, then defining what the infrastructure would be and what it would deliver, defining the benefits of such an infrastructure, actually writing the business case, including the legals and financial, and also lobbying and external relations that would gain support outside of our own computational community for this infrastructure. So the first part, engaging the stakeholders. So who are the stakeholders? In our case, and I think this applies with most infrastructures, of course, we had the scientists, we had industry, member state governors governments who effectively own and ultimately fund the infrastructure, the policymakers, the funding organisations in the national countries, from governmental and charities, and also society at large, because this infrastructure is meant to address some of the major, the key challenges to society. So how did we go about contacting the individual countries? So the first step was really to identify the scientific collaborators in each country. These are effectively the champions for the infrastructure. They help to engage and align all their national scientists around a common aim, and they create a critical mass of key scientists in the national node. It's very clear that countries would not fund or become members of this infrastructure unless a sufficient number of scientists felt this was important. And to enable this, I, with my project manager, visited many European countries during this period. And it usually worked rather well. We would first meet maybe in the afternoon with the scientists. We would discuss the situation in that country. They would hopefully have already thought about things and maybe prepared the ground with pre-meetings and discussions on what they wanted to do and contribute. And then the following morning, we perhaps met with the funders together with the national scientists. And one of the key main aims of these meetings was to actually engage the funding representatives so that they joined in future discussions, and if possible, they attended our future research infrastructure meetings so that they would feel gradually that they were the ones who own the infrastructure. The second step here was to actually define what the infrastructure was. And that involved lots of different things. One was just the simple mechanics of organising and deciding which meetings we needed to have, because a single annual general meeting was not sufficient to do this complex work. We needed many committees and many different meetings. We have to decide on the governance of the infrastructure. Again, something that in many ways I didn't understand before we started, but I soon came to realise this is critical and has to be defined as soon as possible and defined to be clear. The legal arrangements for the Memorandum of Understanding, the funding strategy, including estimates of what the infrastructure would cost, the benefits, the lobbying and outreach, and the overall coordination. So those were effectively all work packages in our preparatory phase. So just thinking then about deciding on the structure. To do this, we really wanted to involve all of our stakeholders. And so this was something that we did at the annual general meetings where everybody could be involved. But in order to have a sensible discussion, it was clear that we needed some straw man models so that we weren't coming at this completely randomly, because very often scientists don't think about governance. They're used to their own research groups, etc. And so a governance for this sort of distributed infrastructure was really quite new, and we had to create some models. It's clear also in this that both the scientists and the funders need to be engaged. Whatever structure is decided on, it has to be able to deliver the goals of the infrastructure. So amongst all the discussions, to me, the key fact was that whatever structure we decided on had to be practical and capable of delivery. And so for ELIXIR, we ended up with a hub and nodes model that I've already shown you. I have to say it was both exhaustive and exhausting, the discussions on the roles of the hub and the roles of the node. And this really evolved or developed over time. It wasn't something that one could define on day one, but it gradually evolved to where it is now. And so we have the hub and the nodes. For ELIXIR, the hub is really the coordination part. The delivery of the infrastructure is done from the nodes. And so both hubs and nodes are really, the hub and the nodes are critical parts of this. Now, in order to have these discussions, we needed numerous committees. And we started off with the steering committee. This has to have really representatives from every country. So each country has to choose a rep by whatever mechanism they choose, but this has to be agreed by the country. It's not a decision of the steering committee. We wanted representatives from industry, and then we wanted committees for all the major platforms who would actually develop plans for what could be delivered. So we had a data committee, a tools committee, a training committee, and a standards and interoperability committee. Those were essentially scientific committees. They were run by scientists. They decided from their own knowledge, scientific knowledge, of what the priorities for each of those platforms would be. But in addition to that, we needed a committee for governance, to define the governance, and we needed a committee to look at the legals, the legal side of things, and the finance. And these are very intertwined. Although we had separate work packages, in fact, the membership of these committees was more determined by people who worked in funding councils, or people who maybe were directors of institutes, or people with legal expertise, or people with accountancy expertise. And it really wasn't the scientists ultimately who, I wouldn't say decided, the scientists knew what they wanted, but in order to turn that into a governance model and a finance model in legal terms, these other people with this expertise were absolutely critical. And those people are really rather few and far between. And it really is identifying some usually an institute or a country who would be willing to commit some of their experts to this task. And another area that is equally important is the Outreach and Benefits Committee. And I have to say, it was this part that I seriously underestimated when we started. Defining the benefits is just critical for the success of setting up an infrastructure. For the governance, we developed these straw men models. Obviously, we looked at previous examples that had worked well. I've already said it's closely linked to financial and legal. So today, the legal model that is used is usually something called an ERIC, which I'm sure you will learn about in other lectures. But when we started, this was hardly been thought of, and it really wasn't clear at all legally how these infrastructures would work. Now, as a consequence of that, ELIXIR became an EMBL special project. EMBL is an international organisation with its own governance and rules, and it was set up especially to work across the whole of Europe. And so many of the issues had already been resolved within EMBL. And so we adopted this model because, frankly, no other model was available. And the governance that was essentially decided for ELIXIR, and I think some variation on this model is what would be needed for all infrastructures. Of course, each infrastructure has to have a board, the ELIXIR board. That board has representatives from all the member states, and it, depending on the country, those are either representatives from the Funding Council or scientists. Very often, a country will send both a funding representative and a scientist to the ELIXIR board meeting. That board meets twice annually, face-to-face. There is a scientific advisory board that, because this is pan-European, for that board, we mainly have members who are outside of Europe, who can be neutral and will really look at what the infrastructure is doing from a critical, usually scientific perspective. This SAB has been critical in reviewing the node applications, in trying to help us to prioritize what we would do. And so that is an important part, and choosing the members of that board of the SAB is done by the ELIXIR board. In addition, there was a separate industry advisory committee because this was an aspect that we felt was very important to show that we were not only working for academic research, but also working for industrial research. We have a director who is based in the hub, and we also have a heads of node committee that meets 4 times annually, 2 teleconferences and 2 face-to-face. And so this structure for us has been really important. The main decisions, scientific decisions, are taken in the heads of nodes, but the governance, legal decisions, and also the way the infrastructure operates is taken in the main board. So I've mentioned the legals, the Memorandum of Understanding, and in ELIXIR we have consortium agreements because by definition an infrastructure has to deliver things. And therefore the nodes have to agree legally, and they do that by an agreement between the node and the hub, that they will deliver certain aspects of the infrastructure. So writing these legal documents, getting everybody to agree as far as possible, The details are incredibly complex, and we had some really good lawyers who not only understood the legal side, but were willing to listen to the scientists about what we needed in order to deliver the things we needed to deliver. And this really is complex, and every country, I've said below, each European country is different. We all have different legal systems and different constraints. The scientists, although traditionally we're not too keen on interacting with the legal side of things, they really have to get involved so that the documents that are generated deliver what is needed. And we need these qualified, experienced international lawyers. So this whole process is very time consuming, and of course legal time is very expensive as well. And all I can say is it is absolutely essential, and you can't do the infrastructure without spending the time on this aspect. And so once, I'm not going to say very much about implementation, but once an infrastructure becomes operational, then for ELIXIR we have a Handbook of Operations. And this, we need the node applicant to apply to say what they are going to do. We need the collaboration agreement. We have the heads of node committee. We have training and technical coordinators. We have the SAB, the industry advisory committee, the platforms and ad hoc working groups as they go. And the Handbook of Operations really sets the ground rules, or the, if you like, rules of engagement for all of this. And again, this is a legal-ish document and is important for the operation of the infrastructure. So obviously no infrastructure can exist without appropriate funding. So we need to define a model which is seen to be fair for all. And that, again, as you can imagine, is less than trivial. More than trivial. I mean, it's very difficult, because a model which is fair for some countries is perceived as unfair by other countries. And so it's critical in this that individuals from the different funding councils, effectively from the different countries, are present and engage with this and are willing to be cooperative and find a solution to this. One of the challenges there is that often the membership of the ELIXIR board is not always continuous, because people in the funding councils will change their positions, and then we get a new person and that person isn't aware about what's happened already, etc. And so this needs to be identified as a risk that is addressed, and if this is a high possibility, then we would suggest that countries would send two people looking to give some sustainability on this. Also, for funding, at the beginning, it's really critical to have the champions, the champion countries, who will invest, who will take a risk and say, we will invest in this. And many of the countries did this before all the legals were completed. And that was very helpful to us, who was trying to set up this infrastructure. It gave us a lot of encouragement. And it really, once one country agrees, it's much, much easier to get the other countries to agree. And the other important thing is that the countries really need to agree to contribute to a central pot to fund the coordination, the hub. Those countries will fund their nodes somewhat independently, but we have to get them to contribute to this central pot. And of course, this is very difficult, because countries, even today, do not like funding outside their own national borders. And in a way, that's understandable, because they don't control it always. But in another way, without that central pot, I don't think it's really possible to run a cohesive, coherent and functioning infrastructure. So our funding model, as I say, is that the nodes are funded by the national agencies and the hub is jointly funded by the ELIXIR member states. And together, the hub and the nodes make joint applications to the Commission for funding. I should also say that there are what are called commissioned services. So the hub will commission some of the nodes, 2 or 3 or maybe more, to deliver a certain aspect of the infrastructure that is needed. The money for that also comes from the joint pot. So this concept of commissioned services by the hub to be delivered by the nodes is a very good way to encourage the nodes to work together. And it can also be used to identify gaps in the infrastructure provision and ask which nodes would like to fill that gap. Such applications are made formally to the members of the hub, and it is the heads of nodes committee that decides on how those commission services are allocated, because obviously there's only so much money to go round, and so the priorities are required, and the SAB will advise if necessary on certain steps. So the benefits document that I mentioned before is really important, and it's important to do actually as soon as possible. It's also useful to have 2 versions of it, a short glossy 2-page pamphlet sort of version and a more technical complete version. I think it becomes quite complicated with numbers, etc., and real concrete things in the complete version. And these are research infrastructures, so obviously the first benefit is for research, but I think one also needs to look at societal and commercial benefits and the benefit of building up an area in a given country. So countries, you can think, fall into 2 types. There are the countries that are already expert in the area of the infrastructure. There are other countries that would like to be experts in this infrastructure, and they need some capacity building. And so the ability of the infrastructure to promote capacity building within countries that are not yet at the excellent level, I think, is an important thing. You need to look at who would use the infrastructure, how many people, how many institutes, how many countries, what they would use it for, and what are the commercial benefits. And providing evidence for this rather than hand-waving arguments can be really helpful. And on that, it can be very useful to commission an external independent review of the benefits. So certainly for EMBL-EBI, we had an external cost benefits analysis performed by somebody who'd done this across many different areas. And this has proved to be very useful in raising funding, certainly in the UK, but I think from our member states in EMBL. Part of this benefits is to really demonstrate impact. And we can do that in various ways. Now, for the infrastructure, for us, it was about data, in part, and tools, but for the data. And between the period 2010 to 2015, there were over 30,000 patents that used bioinformatics repositories to identify genes or enzymes or variants. And so that has an impact on vaccine development, drug development, beauty care, industrial enzymes. And so this sort of impact, if you can get it for your infrastructure, is very powerful, especially when talking to politicians. really the purpose of the preparatory phase is to build, well, really to write the scientific case, the business case for the infrastructure. And that, if you like, is the ultimate deliverable of the preparatory phase. And so we need to identify the chief deliverables, say why it's scientifically important, say why you can't do this in one institute or indeed in one country. So why does this have to be a pan-European infrastructure? What will each node contribute? And there are many parts to this when you're building and writing this scientific case, and each part needs a separate leader, and somebody needs to coordinate this overall. And I was the PI for the prep phase, but I had a huge amount of help from people, not only at EMBL-EBI or at EMBL that was critical, but also from people around Europe. It's quite an administrative task, and having that admin support is really valuable. And when you do this, the purpose of this is really to ensure that everybody is on the same page, that you have consensus for what you're trying to do and the position and what you would like to do. And sometimes you think you've reached consensus and then you find out actually different people think you've agreed to different things. And so writing it down in a business case certainly helps. It doesn't solve that problem, but it goes towards solving it. So I guess just to conclude, fundamentally when you're doing this, the key thing is to develop trust with national policymakers and funders. You really need a strong relationship with the national funding bodies and their legal representatives. This doesn't happen overnight, and you really need to start at the beginning of the prep phase, and you build confidence really through getting to know one another and through open dialogue. And personal interactions remain extremely important. So the last key thing to do is to lobby in the member states and in Brussels. This is totally essential. It's extremely time consuming and it involves everyone. So if you are coordinating an infrastructure, the sort of key message is make sure you use everyone. You will not be able to do this even with a small group. You need people, champions in every country who know their own system and will shout up for you. And there are many different target audience, the scientists, the funders, the bureaucrats, the politicians, and even broader society. So if I could just mention a little the politicians, I think increasingly as scientists we realise engaging with politicians is part of our job, and that we need to engage with our own MPs, members of parliament, and with the members of the European Parliament. These are very difficult people to get hold of. Not every MP or every MEP would be interested in research infrastructures. So you need to find who to talk to and target those individuals as well as you can. And again, the personal contact really does make a difference. And the broader society is important, but fundamentally these are infrastructures for research, and one can only get support from society by getting society to appreciate the value of research. And so that broader involvement with society is what's needed, and that should be done by every scientist involved. And of course, almost all of us today, especially the scientists, but also the funding bodies, use the web all the time. And so a professional, up-to-date website is essential. And that needs to have two parts. The part that is internal, for internal communication. And again, I've not mentioned that very much, but that is both difficult and necessary and time consuming. And also the external part that addresses the people, the other people, the funders, the bureaucrats, the politicians, etc., seen here. And so as you need different parts of the website for the different audiences. And you need to stay engaged. So now we've got Twitter and LinkedIn. And one of the very nice things that ELIXIR has done, of course, in these developments of infrastructure, there are many papers written that are effectively internally written to decide where to go, or there might be something on open data, for example. And one of the very good developments is that these are now published on the F1000 Research ELIXIR channel. And that helps to make it open and transparent. And it also gives a publication that can be helpful for the scientists involved. And so there is a publication that's sent out now from ELIXIR every 3 months, and you can sign up, etc. This is really important. As I say, it's difficult. You need to, frankly, invest the money to get the people who will help you to do this well, because it really is critical. And so, just to conclude, the timelines for this are long term. Certainly for ELIXIR, and I believe for many of the other infrastructures, we're trying to create infrastructures that will last for the next 50 years. They will change, obviously, but they will be important. That's why they're being developed. And believe you me, this is not a trivial task to set up these infrastructures, and you only do it for those infrastructures that are really necessary for research and in a long-term basis. It's not something that lasts 2 or 3 years. It's not like a normal EU project. It's something which has a long timeline. And you need a governance model that will provide long-term financial stability. You need to ensure that the programme that you are developing complements rather than competes with national scientific priorities. So merging these priorities together is critical. And you also need to allow it to adapt. We know evolution works by gradual adaptation. The people or the infrastructures that survive will be those that are flexible and can adapt to both the new technological developments and the emerging themes. So this is critical. So for ELIXIR, the time we started this in 2006, I wrote my first emails about ELIXIR, although it wasn't called that then, but that was what it was. And eventually the permanent phase, the implementation, began in about 2014. So that was a span of 8 years to do that. So I guess my last message is to be patient. It takes a long time. And to do this, you really need to believe that this is what's necessary, because otherwise you will lose the will to live. So just go slowly, be patient, and work towards what you believe is the right thing to do. And so with that, I will close. Thank you.